Thank you for joining us. We're going to have talks from 3 organisations. We've got Pearl Protectors from Sri Lanka. We've got Andrés del Castillo from the Centre for International and Environmental Law, and we've got Amy Youngman from the Environmental Investigation Agency. And I'm Heather McFarlane from FIDRA, and I'm the project manager working on our NEDL work, which includes this webinar, but also many of you will know us from the Great Global Nurdle Hunt. So I'm joined by my colleagues who you've probably been in touch with at some point. So I have Danny.
Hi, everyone.
And Jamie, who you'll be hearing from later.
Hello.
So yeah, I'm going to just about get started. We may move the agenda around a little bit, as one of our speakers is yet to arrive. So if that's all right with you, Andrés, we may come straight to you. So why are we doing this webinar? Well, the Plastics Treaty is on its way, we hope, and the next round of negotiations is starting soon. And we've seen submissions coming in, and some of which include mention of pellets from governments, some of which include mentions of plastic pellets from the various different NGOs that are organising with it. And we thought it was time to bring some of those NGOs together and bring some of our discussions together about how the treaty may address pellets. And there's different opinions on this, and there's different ways we could go about doing it. And hopefully there'll be ideas that you can take away from today's discussions. But I think the important thing to remember is that plastic pellets is one of those issues that should be solvable but hasn't yet been. It's a massive environmental issue coming straight from the plastic industry straight out into the environment. So it's plastic that's been wasted before it's even been made into anything. And there's 2 ways it gets into the environment. If you like, there's the kind of chronic loss of pellets all along the supply chain, and then there's these big acute spills that hopefully we'll be hearing about shortly from Pearl Protectors as well. So there's those 2 main routes, both of which we think can be addressed, partly by the Plastics Treaty, but other work going on at the IMO, and you may have joined us for our last webinar. So that's why we're doing it, and importantly, because we've seen plastic washing up on beaches here, and you've probably seen plastic washing up on beaches where you are, and a lot of that unseen plastic sometimes, it's difficult to spot, but it is there, is those nurdles. So nurdles or plastic pellets is becoming a real issue across the world, and the more you look for it, it seems the more that we find. So I will move us along, I think, to our first speaker. So I'm not sure whether Pearl Protectors have joined us yet. Are they?
No.
Okay, what we'll do is go straight to Andrés then and hear from him about his work on the Plastic Treaty.
Thank you, and I hope you can hear me well. I will try to share a little presentation to visualize the amount of information that I will try to share. And you let me know if can you see the slides?
Yes, we can see the slides.
Okay, perfect. So hello everybody, my name is Andrés del Castillo, senior attorney working at the Center for International Environmental Law, and we are working since many years on something that now is getting more concrete, and is a global plastic treaty, a legally binding instrument to tackle the plastics crisis. And I call this presentation the road to Paris, but not to the Paris Agreement, because this is what we will try to avoid: voluntary measures or something that is weak, and we need something mandatory to tackle this plastic pollution crisis. And Paris is the place where will take place the second round of negotiation of the plastic treaty. The first one took place in Montevideo. But first, I want to share that quoting Gabriel Garcia Marquez on what is the very scale of our solitude. And we know that 3 weeks ago, the the AR6 summary report on climate change was released, and this graphic shows what is the path scenario from now to 2100. And we overpose from 2019 the production
Andrés?
of plastics.
Andrew, sorry to interrupt you. The slides aren't showing. Are you able to send us a copy and we'll try and load them here?
Yeah.
Ah, there they are.
Now they're working. Okay. Hopefully, yes. So here you can see kind of the graphic showing the very scale of our solitude and showing how plastic production is growing and growing and growing. And in the next decades, that will triple to passing from 400,000 million tons of plastic to 1 million, almost 1 billion tons of plastic that will be produced every year. And this is overposed to different crises, the climate, the biodiversity crisis, and of course the pollution one. So, but first let me start with what is plastics pollution, because this is really relevant. And we like this definition by the OECD, that is a simple definition, but is comprehensive. And they say that plastic pollution is broadly all emissions and risk resulting from plastic production, use, waste management, and leakage. And under this definition, we understand that one of the main thing that we need to do instead to make sure that the plastic industry remain in the carbon budget, rather than growing by 44% annually, the demand and the supply of plastic need to be reduced by 3% every year if we want to halt by 2050 and to keep in the carbon budget for the plastic industry. Then I want to show a little bit the timeline or when we are with the plastic treaty negotiations. As I said before, we had last year 3 main events. First, of course, the adoption by consensus of a mandate that is a resolution that contains the recipe for what the countries want to see in a legally binding instrument. Then a preparatory meeting where they decided to have 5 rounds of negotiations and recommended to have 11 members of the Bureau. And also in the 5 rounds of negotiation, the first one took place in Punta del Este in Uruguay in November 2022. Where they decide to work in 2 main work streams or clusters. The first one is more on substantive issues, and the second one's on means of implementation. And during that meeting in Uruguay, they request UNEP to produce a report on option element for a future plastics treaty. This is kind of the bullet point form of what can be a zero draft or a text for negotiators to start working on a specific text. And you can see the red dot, and is where we are right now. Last week, UNEP released that report that was asked or requested by the governments. And this report is when I want to go a little bit more in detail, showing what has been said there about plastics pellets in particular. This is also what we consider at CIEL as the proposed objective of the plastic treaty, and is we need to protect human health, the environment from all impacts, hazards, and risks associated with plastics, and these need to include microplastics throughout the full life cycle based on the precautionary principle and following a risk-based approach. And here's where we are with a really interesting explanation of what is the full life cycle of plastics. And this is a report that will be adopted hopefully at the BRS Conference of the Parties in May, that contain the governance of chemicals and plastics, and give you a detailed value chain graphic of the full life cycle of plastics, starting with the upstream part of plastic feedstocks, plastic precursors, and plastic materials. I understand that plastic pellets will be between plastic precursors and plastic materials, between the chemical phase and the material phase, and also going down before the plastic products is what we understand. And but then going to definitions, we understand that there is only one legally binding definition that is legally binding for 17 parties of what we consider primary microplastics, that is tiny particles designed for direct commercial use or for indirect use. And in their indirect use, we understand that plastic or pre-production pellets fit that definition. Then the GSAMP also kind of give a definition more describing what can be considered plastic feedstocks. And OECD also give you this kind of idea that is something that is smaller than 5 millimeters of diameter by design. Then the ISO give you another definition, but they consider not as primary microplastic, but as large microplastics, these between 1 millimeter and 5 millimeters, and they consider the plastic pellets as an intermediate form as large microplastics. So you see, even in definitions, there is no clarity on what it means, but this is something that for sure need to be informed. And what we say primary microplastic, we don't say primary raw materials, right? Virgin plastics. Pellets can be also secondary raw materials or coming from recycling. So this is something that we look forward to see in a future plastic treaty. Then one of the main obligations that was portrayed in this UNEP report on option elements is an obligation of phasing out or reducing the supply, demand, and use of primary plastic polymers. And on this, you can see already some countries that the reflection of what some countries asked, that is an inventory of emission of the loss of pre-production pellets. For instance, Cook Islands suggested that. And one of the control measures will be the track types of volumes of plastic polymers, precursors, feedstocks manufactured, the importation and the exportation. And Sri Lanka, of course, requests the control of transboundary movement of plastics through transportation modes, sea and air. And this is also reflected in different parts as applying import and export requirements for parties and establish licensing schemes for production, import, and export of virgin and secondary plastic polymers. So in the option paper, also we have a specific and only mention of on plastic pellets in one of the obligation or categories of obligations that will be on microplastics. And when they classify on unintentional release, they talk about UNEP put this control measure of minimize the risk of leakage of plastic pellets from production, handling, transport, and use of certain products. We see already that this comes from the European Union submission to UNEP when they were suggesting this as something that need to be tackled. We know also that some other countries go more broadly. Instead of only talking about plastic pellets, they also talk about flakes, powders, and not only during production, but they also specify the manufacture part because it's not only the production of pellet, but the manufacture of the product that will result from those for the treatment of those pellets too. Then the other suggestion is also how to make sure that there is some mandate on the use of best practice to minimize those losses. And here we need to pay attention about the wording. One thing is to minimize the risk, and the other thing is to minimize directly the loss. One can be related more to an obligation of results, and the other will be an obligation of means. So what will be the real obligation for countries, and therefore for the companies doing the different actions along the supply chain of plastics, right? And here, on the option paper, we see also more a general control measure on the reduction and, when it's feasible, the elimination of release of plastics to water, soil, and air. And we see, for example, that Rwanda requests that that the state and each party will need to take steps to eliminate release of plastics, and this will be part of a source categories that will be listed in an annexes, and one of the categories that they include there is the transport and handling of plastic pellets again. And we see also how another submission, Norway, talks about base available technology, but also an obligation, what they said is any obligation of measure need to seek the complementarity and to not duplicate the efforts that other conventions, for instance, the IMO specifically is doing. We saw that Norway and the UK specifically talk about the work that IMO is doing to not duplicate. And what we understand is the plastic treaty will tackle the full life cycle of plastics. IMO is more centralized on the transport and handling of plastic pellets. So there is a complementarity there, and we need to try to avoid duplication on that, right? Then there is a part related to remediation that as we know that there is some agreed mitigation measures that will be discussed later in April at the IMO. And one of that is access to remediation. And by remediation is broadly understood not only as a part of compensation, but also on remedial measures to control micro nanoplastic leakage into the environment is something that, of course, is reflected in the Sri Lankan submissions to the INC. And this is where they want to see some remediation activities, not only for micro, but also for nanoplastics. And then a duty on decontamination of plastic contaminated sites too, in an environmental friendly manner. And here again, there is some connection that need to be made with the recent with the text of the BBNJ that was pre-adopted last March, where plastic pollution was included as a vector of pollution and something to be tackled also beyond national jurisdiction. And for that, there will be some work to do. Finally, the question of finance too. We know that Sri Lanka requested the provision of global technical and financial assistance in disaster related to plastics, and they put specifically the example of the cheap disaster Express Pearl there. And we know that in the UNEP document there is a reflection of the need to funding dedicated to tackling existing or legacy plastic pollution in the environment, and the need to explore innovative and financing opportunities like a plastic fee, taxes of levies. From CIEL, we consider that a coordinated fee to targeting manufacturers and producer of virgin plastic will be necessary to put in a pool to try to help to implement the different provisions of the conventions. And this, of course, will also tackle these needs to work more on pellet leakage and releases. So from CIEL, we have also 3 specific documents that we released 2 weeks ago, one more on circularity. And that means also that the toxicity on plastics is a problem, and the toxicity will go again if we talk about recycling to pellets. And those 3 holes of secondary raw material and virgin raw material need to be equal. We cannot be permissive of having some 3 holes, some toxicities for primary pellets and not the same for recyclable or secondary raw material pellets. And then also microplastic on the air, and finally on parties and non-parties measures. Thank you so much, and sorry for my long explanation.
Thank you, Andrés. That was fantastic, and really good points made about the potential for secondary pellets to become a problem, and we need to be really careful that those thresholds are the same. It was also really interesting to see Sri Lanka coming up a lot. We'll be hearing from pill protectors in a little bit once we've heard from Amy, who's going to talk to us more about EIA's work and how others can get involved with the plastic treaty. So I'm going to hand over to Amy, who is sharing her slides now.
Thank you, Heather. Can everyone see my slides? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so thank you, and thank you to FIDRA for hosting this solution series to address pellets. As she mentioned, my name is Amy. I work for EIA as a legal and policy specialist. I think Andrés just did an incredible job of giving us an overview of where we are in this treaty making process. And I think that in this pellet space, EIA is kind of uniquely situated because my colleagues like Andrés and CIEL have been involved in the treaty process from the beginning. And we're also involved with the plastic pollution in the IMO space and in the UK and EU policy, where we will hopefully receive a proposal about pellets in the next few months. And so from this vantage point, we understand the capacity to different international instruments to govern this issue. And we certainly recognize how important different international instruments can be, especially when we look at IMO and regulating transportation. But we also want to say that the treaty is kind of unique because it gives us this opportunity to have a global holistic view. And so while IMO is certainly important and something that we're working on, we want to synergize language and practices. But in our view, again, this needs to be governed through the global plastics framework. And yeah, so we have this unique opportunity to take a step back and kind of reframe the lens from a wider view and create a framework instrument that coordinates existing regulation, but addresses the problem across the entire life cycle rather than just trying to avoid leakage or address remediation when spills occur. All right, so before I get into how we view the governance of pellets in the treaty, I briefly want to frame why this is important, and I think we'll hear more later on, but plastic pellets are produced by petrochemical companies that transport them around the world to plastic manufacturing companies, where they are then melted down for production of all of our plastic products. And since 2005, we see the exponential expansion of the production of raw plastic materials, which has resulted in greater generation of pellets requiring more transportation, and that creates more waste with more regular spills. So we know that billions of pellets end up in the marine environment each year, and these pellets are full of toxic additives that are poisoning biodiversity, marine life, and harming human health. And unfortunately, we now know that this is not just an ocean issue, right? This is also, pellets are also found in freshwater, they're found in soil, they break down into particles that are in the air. So this is really a planet issue. And this is a little bit of a reiteration of what Andrés was already presented, but when we think about pellets, naturally we want to think about governing the spills into the environment, or what we call leakage in the treaty. But again, this treaty gives us the opportunity to reframe the issue and govern the entire life cycle of plastics. And so I've done my best to map out how EIA views the life cycle and stages of plastic for governance. We have upstream, midstream, and downstream. And using this one example of one type of microplastic, we can see how interrelated and necessary governance is at each stage. If we want to address this issue holistically, we have to start upstream, and then we have to have robust governance across the life cycle and value chain. So the third row is a non-exhaustive list of current options for elements in the treaty that I view as relevant to pellets governance, reducing leakage, but also minimizing the harmful effects when spills do occur. So first, we have to start at the source. We have to turn off the plastic tap. This is crucial because otherwise petrochemical companies will continue to create virgin pellets. So it starts with putting a cap and phase down on virgin plastic polymer production. That helps to address the physical aspect of pellet pollution. When we reduce the amount of virgin plastics, we reduce physical leakage. But we also need to address the chemical side of pollution. We know that the toxic additives that leak into the environment cause a lot of harm to both the environment and human health. And currently there are over 10,000 chemicals being used in production. And while scientists are working very hard to get all the research out on those chemicals, there's enough evidence to show that they're extremely harmful to human health and the environment. So we need to restrict those harmful polymers and chemicals to protect our health. But also as we move down the life cycle, we need to reduce them so that we can increase circularity, so we can eliminate polymers that may hinder recyclability for safe secondary materials, as Andrés was just talking about. And then again, so that if leakage does occur, pellets are less toxic and harmful in the environment. And this is only effective if we create transparency and traceability across the entire value chain. So we need transparent reporting for production volumes and chemical composition for both virgin pellets and secondary sources of pellets, which often hinder the non-toxic circularity. And then we need reporting on imports and exports, on use of plastic by market segment, and on leakage. And that way we can track where those pellets end up, where there may be the most leakage in the supply chain. And once we have the baselines and inventories, we can use the reporting to monitor the implementation and compliance of the treaty. We can see how much ends up in the environment and how effective our strategy is. And as you can see on this slide, leakage occurs throughout every stage for pellets, from production to handling across the supply chain and transportation. And although this may seem a bit disheartening from a governance standpoint, the answer is really straightforward. And this should be viewed as an exciting opportunity for us as advocates in the space to make a massive impact. These spills are preventable. And for example, a study by Youngman found that in Europe, if we implement a supply chain regulatory approach, which has to include mandatory reporting and minimum obligations for operators to implement the best practices and management, we can reduce about 600,000 tons of pellet pollution by 2035, and that's a 95% reduction in emissions. So when we go to the options for elements paper that Andrés already kind of introduced us to, apart from where we can try to implement pellet language upstream or midstream, the focus in the options paper seems to be on the article in the downstream, where we focus on eliminating the release to air, water, and land. So here we can see again the text in the options paper. And I know that Andrés has already talked about some of the negotiating points we want to discuss further, so I won't get too into that, but I think that this is really good and a really great opportunity for us to see robust governance on this issue. So it's good that it was included in the text, and we have kind of a baseline to get this into the zero draft that we're working on in Paris. And I'm calling this one the source-based approach. I think that having a dedicated article for microplastics is really interesting. I think that it needs to be fleshed out, and what's really important is that we include mandatory binding supply chain approach into this section. And then we also need to have guidance that the Conference of the Parties can easily amend and update as far as minimum requirements for best management and handling practices during production, transportation, packaging, storage, and conversion. There also should be some mandatory language surrounding reporting and transparency in this part. And I think that countries should be mandated to adopt national legislation for the supply chain approach. And then we have the second option here. This is something that we at EIA are calling a dedicated program of work, the sectoral approach. It identifies specific industries that create a lot of pollution. And so we think that microplastics could fit in here. I think we saw the Rwanda and maybe the Cook Islands submissions also saying that microplastics should be tackled from a sectoral approach. And the reason that this might work well is because we'll then be able to regulate all 4 sources of microplastics, but in a way that facilitates sectoral engagement and meeting the obligations of the instrument and promoting cooperation between existing instruments and multi-stakeholder initiatives. So in my view, yeah, it's a great fit, because then we would be able to correspond with developments in the IMO space, and regulating maritime transport of pellets is really important because it's transboundary, it's very vulnerable to spills. And so using the 2 instruments to work together would really inform best practices and ensure implementation. And I know I'm running a little bit low on time, but I do want to flag something that Andrés brought up with the Legacy Fund. So I completely agree, if big spills do occur, we do want to include a remediation mechanism. And I think that including the Legacy Pollution Trust Fund that is financed by the private sector is a way for industry to internalize the externalities of pollution. We know that pellets are ridiculously cheap, but we all know that the spillage is a massive cost to our planet's health. So that would be important that we can include in the financial mechanism to make sure that we have money if big spills do occur. Lastly, I just want to talk about ways which we can get involved in the treaty making process. Excuse me. So we will be in Paris next month, working hard to get the zero draft done. And then the next meeting will be in Nairobi, possibly during these days, but that's going to be confirmed in Paris. We at EIA are members of both the Break Free from Plastic Coalition and Rethink Plastic Alliance. If you're an NGO, I would highly recommend joining. And yet, for the sake of time, maybe if people are more interested, we could talk about engagement a little bit further in a Q&A session. But before I hand it back, I do want to quickly say that EIA produces some briefings on essential elements that we think are critical to include in the treaty. And you can find past versions on our website. But my colleague Jacob has just authored one on microplastics that will be published in the next few weeks. It's a great way to familiarize yourself with talking points ahead of meetings with your government. And I would be happy to coordinate with FIDRA. I know that they have a great hub where we can share information, and I can get that to everyone on this call. I think that that's it on my end. Yeah, if you have any questions or comments, I will look forward to answering them in the Q&A, or you can always email me. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Amy. And yes, let's pick up some of those discussions on how to get involved. And I saw your really helpful list of ways to get in touch with your government. So let's go back to that. It was also interesting to hear you saying the need for remediation. And I think our colleagues from Pearl Protectors are joining us now. And I can certainly say that they'll be backing up that point with the challenges that they've had. So good to see you, Muditha. And we also have Maleesha joining us, and they'll be doing back-to-back quick session. So it's fantastic to see you again, Muditha. I'll hand over to you to tell everyone about the spills that you've been dealing with.
Sure. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are joining in from. So my name is Muditha, and I'm the coordinator of the Pearl Protectors. Pearl Protectors is a youth-led marine conservation organization in Sri Lanka. Joining with me is Maleesha Gunawardana. She's the advocacy lead with the Pearl Protectors as well. So she has been working on the advocacy movement of the disaster that happened in Sri Lanka. So I want to really touch base on first of all, what happened in Sri Lanka, and then move on to like what are the solutions that we are kind of highlighting here. So all of you, I'm sure all of you, hope you all can see my screen. Could you see my screen?
Yeah, it's looking good. Well, it's looking horrific, but we can see the horrific thing.
Yep. I mean, wanted to really highlight from this, starting from this, is because this disaster, and we express Pearl disaster, which we saw in 2021, May 25th, was a disaster, a global disaster. We saw the largest amounts of plastic pellets spilling onto the sea. Right now, we believe about 500 billion pellets may have spilled out in different forms to the sea. So just to highlight what this disaster really brought about, I mean, this was the first such large disaster in the Indian Ocean. We saw multiple impacts, starting off with the toxic fumes on the 25th till about 30th of May 2021. We saw this amount of chemicals being fumed, and a lot of marine animals started washing up, close to about 300 to 400 reported cases, and there were so much more unreported cases of turtles, dolphins, and so much more just washing up on the beaches afterwards. The oil spill, there was an oil spill after the disaster as well that was seeping out for a longer duration. A chemical spill, there were a lot of toxic chemicals that were carried on this ship when it met disaster. And then, of course, debris from the vessel, and then the nurdle. So this is the largest, by far the largest nodal spill in the world. And this also created a lot of impacts, which you can see from the images here. Up to this day, there are fishermen reporting that they still find nurdles inside some of the fish they catch, and the problem just continues because it's a form of microplastic. It's very difficult to remove from the environment, and it's very difficult to spot while in the environment. So it creates a lot of challenges to the marine environment. Sri Lanka being an island, a tropical island, there's a lot of marine biodiversity around Sri Lanka, and there's a variety of species of marine animals which are being affected. And not just fish, we are seeing seabirds, turtles also being affected. The turtle season is usually from December to March, and during this time, there's a lot of beaches with nurdles, and like these turtles usually when they nest, they have to dig in where these nurdles are, or they don't come to beaches where it's polluted. So it has become a major challenge in the long run, and it's been difficult to remove nurdles from the environment. It's the third year, and we still see so much of nurdles just washing up still as the monsoon started. This is also another problem which we are seeing, the discoloration of nurdles. As this happens, it becomes very much more difficult to remove these from the environment, and it has compounded the challenges that we have in removing it. So based on these, you could see the extent of how it has distributed, and we are getting reports of how there are nurdles in Maldives as well. During one of the last sessions, we had a presentation from Maldives on how they found clusters of nurdles. So you can see it's not just a problem in Sri Lanka, it has become a regional problem, and it has become a global problem, just one incident. Also, this is a modeling done by Professor Charita Patiarachi, who's a renowned oceanographer. You can see how these nurdles have just started to move across the Indian Ocean, and the Indian Ocean it has become a hotspot of transboundary marine litter. We know how MH370, the debris were found on the other side of the Indian Ocean. Similarly, the nurdles have been reported from many other parts as well, and it continues to spread throughout the Indian Ocean and beyond. Moving on, so the pearl protectors, what we did was initially we were helping out the authorities with doing surveys, but we knew there was urgency in removing these nurdles, and we started surveying these nurdle locations along the Western Province and trying to mobilize volunteers to those locations and try to remove them as soon as possible. And it was effective to a certain extent, because by removing much of those nurdles during the initial stage, we were able to remove so much of nurdles, but it still hasn't been the complete solution. We've been trying to develop tools to try to filter out these nurdles from the sand, and we've been mobilizing volunteers, and also we've been setting up nurdle portals, setting up these tools along the beaches so that anybody can come and start using it. All these were done because we know the extent of how these nurdles could spread around and how it could impact the coastal ecosystem and the marine ecosystem in the long run. And up to this date, there are a lot of nurdles coming in. So these are a few statistics of what we did, how much of nurdles we collected. In 5 districts, we mobilized about 3,000 volunteers and done about 48 major cleanups, making it one of the longest running, continuously running volunteer campaigns in the world and the largest in Sri Lanka so far. So what we understand from this is how large the extent of these nodal spills can be. Like, so for example, these are some of the recorded maritime disasters where like spillage has happened in the sea, and so we could see Sri Lanka is not the only case. And recently, Dubai joined in on the ranks in February, where there was a nodal spill in Dubai, and this is going to continue. It's going to continue because there hasn't been, I mean, as we discussed before, there are still policies in place to be implemented, but nothing is in place, especially in the maritime sector. There's a lot of things that we need to implement, and we want to really highlight on IMO's responsibilities here as well. So with this, I want to move it. I want to hand it over to Maleesha, where she'll be talking about how the plastic treaty is, how we can take this forward through that. Maleesha?
Thank you, Muditha. I hope you can all hear me.
Yes.
So I'm Maleesha Gunawardana, and I'm the advocacy lead of the Pear Protectors. Just give me a second till I share my screen. Can you let me know if you can see this?
Yes.
So, like Muditha said, we were hit with the biggest nurdle disaster, and we were in no way nurdle experts at the time that Express Pearl decided to, cause that spillage in our legal waters. And so this ship sort of forced us to learn more about nurdles, and thanks to all of the organizations that are on the panel today, including FIDRA, we were able to learn more, and within a very short period of time, come up with ways to contain this spill, support the government in finding more expertise on what nurdles are and how to clean them up and how to contain them, and also how to responsibly dispose them. And after 2 years of cleanup, we've sort of come to the point where we've realized we'll never be able to completely collect back all the nurdles that were spilled from this ship. So we are now, and we have been continually trying to push for regulations that would prevent another Express Pearl happening in our waters or in any other waters. So the IMO, as you know, is the body that's responsible for regulating shipping, and also they're the ones who are able to provide solutions to prevent pellet loss at sea. So in 2021, the Sri Lankan government and others asked the IMO to classify nurdles as hazardous under the IMDG code. And in 2022, Norway and others have sort of, added on to that proposal and asked for pellets to be classified under MARPOL. And the result of that was a new committee being set up, and 3 propositions have been brought about to now classify plastic pellets, to subject them to stronger regulations. And the next meeting, as we heard from the government itself, will be in April this year. And what we've also been told is that it will take about a year to finalize these measures, which for us seems like a very long time, because 2 years after the disaster, we're still dealing with the repercussions of the nurdle spill. And so it doesn't take very long for another nurdle spill to happen. So hopefully within the next year, till these regulations are being put in place, we won't experience another Express Pearl disaster in our waters. Moving on to the areas that the IMO can address for pellet loss at sea is, first of all, starting with the packaging. It has to be resistant to any impact, fire, or any tear or wear. So when we first saw the nurdles coming in, we saw this massive, massive load of nurdles on our beaches that looked like plastic snow. And that could have been prevented had these nurdles been packaged differently. What we saw were these polysacks that had been torn off, and all the nurdles had just gone into the water and gone into the beaches. So had they been packaged properly, they would have still remained in the containers, and cleanup would have been much more easier, and the impact on the environment would have been far less. And also the labeling, it was very difficult to figure out what the nurdles included, like whether they were HDPE or LDPE. There were different types of nurdles in that ship, and the cargo manual hadn't really defined whether the plastics they carried were stored in the form of nurdles or not. And it took a long time for Sri Lanka to figure out how many nurdles were in fact on the ship. So we were going by estimates. And also the storage. It needs to be stored below deck or in a stack so that in case of an accident, it doesn't easily spill out onto the ocean. So had these measures been in place before, Sri Lanka would not have gone through the disaster it did, because it was incredible to see how just one ship impacted not just the marine environment, but also our economy. This was already when we were being hit by the COVID-19 impacts. So I think Sri Lanka would be the, we would be sort of the example of why IMO really needs to fasten their track towards putting these regulations in place. And also we were struggling with
Maleesha,
yeah.
some of the screen is cut off. Do you want us to share your slides instead?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Okay, we can do that. Thanks. You carry on and we'll catch up.
All right. Shall I stop sharing? Are we in the disaster response slide?
Yeah, we're there. So you carry on.
Okay, awesome. So another thing was when it comes to cleanup. So we right away know that we can't just pick up these pellets like we would during our plastic cleanups. So we had to come up with equipment to try and separate these nurdles from the sand. And we talked to experts from other countries, and we came up with our own version of a nurdle trommel and also handheld sieves. And it was a trial and error, trying to figure out which works best. And the government was also doing their part in figuring out the best way to remove these pellets from the sand, because they were quickly embedded in the sand. It was very difficult a task to keep removing so many nurdles, billions. And so what the IMO can do in addition to classifying nurdles as hazardous is also to support with disaster response, like facilitating training programs that focus on the spill containment, cleanup, and disposal, because right now Sri Lanka is still trying to figure out how we can dispose of these nurdles responsibly, because currently we have them stored so that we can show it as evidence for our upcoming lawsuit, which is going to be a civil and a criminal lawsuit. And after that, we would need to figure out how we dispose all of these nurdles that we've collected. And it would also be great if IMO can support in providing cleaning equipment like trommels and sieves and all these vacuums. And of course, funding. The government has incurred a massive cost in trying to undertake these cleanups, and volunteer organizations were of course supported by donors, but obviously our country, the government cannot afford another nurdle disaster like this. So this graph is actually from FIDRA. I hope you can, are we on that slide right now? Forgot to say next slide, but this is a graph that this is a graph that I took from FIDRA when we were initially doing our research. This was very helpful in figuring out the supply chain, how where nurdles begin and where it ends up. And what we realized soon is that once again, it shouldn't just be looked at the waste stage. Nurdles begin, nurdles are produced in one part of the world and they are transported to a different part of the world to be turned into plastics. So the issue needs to be addressed at all stages. Next slide, please. Is it the Global Plastics Treaty slide, or is it the government lead the change slide?
How can governments lead the change? Global Plastic Treaty can address pellet loss.
Right, so I had an extra slide on my presentation, so I will just quickly go over that. So this is where the Global Plastics Treaty can also be very helpful, because this resolution is aimed at addressing the entire life cycle of plastic, including the production, design, and disposal. So that would mean that pellets are also in the conversation. And we would like to see mandatory regulatory frameworks introduced through this treaty to strengthen the existing frameworks that are trying to limit pellet loss, and also further measures, regional, national, and international measures to prevent pellet loss, because voluntary measures, of course, have not succeeded. in eliminating pellet loss so far. And it's a timely opportunity for all nations and regions around the world to make a commitment to end plastic pellet pollution on land and at sea. And how governments can lead the change is by ratifying relevant maritime conventions like MARPOL and fully incorporating them into their relevant parliamentary legislation. So Sri Lanka, of course, we have signed into MARPOL, but we still have not fully incorporated MARPOL into our legislation as well. And if that's not happening, then the overall effectiveness of all these regulations it's not going to be that effective. And another thing that we thought countries could use even before they might experience a nodal spill is to have a local contingency plan in place. And this is also where there can be intergovernmental support coming in terms of maritime expertise, technology, manpower, and strategy to help contain pellet spills, because we know we needed that when we had our very first and unfortunately the largest nodal spill in the world happened 2 years back. And plastic pellets are sort of circulating around because of the high demand for single-use plastic items. So another way that governments can lead the change and also support the Global Plastics Treaty is by implementing bans on single-use plastic items. Sri Lanka is doing well in terms of that. We have recently proposed to ban 5 more plastic items that will come in this year, but there's a long way to go. And we're quite happy to see news about plastic bans coming from different parts of the world as well. So what we do beyond cleanups, we were recently invited by a committee hearing at the Parliament to present our recommendations for how we can move forward after this Express Pearl disaster. Sri Lanka has been very much focused on getting the compensation for the current disaster. So there hasn't been a lot of progress in terms of changing our domestic regulations and also pushing for international laws. But hopefully, once we get the lawsuit going this year, Sri Lanka can take a lead in advocating for these measures worldwide as well. So we were able to present our recommendations in terms of tackling pellet loss worldwide and also nationally, and it was received well by the parliamentarians. And coming up, we hope to do a report of our containing our pollution survey data and also the lessons that we learned through this cleanup campaign. It was a first for us, and there was a lot of things that we learned from being a country that had never dealt with a pellet loss like this. So we hope to put that all down in a report and share it with everybody. And also we have created a petition to advocate for domestic measures to prepare and prevent nodal spills in Sri Lanka, because if you look at Sri Lankan legislation, the word pellets doesn't even exist in most of our regulations. So we want to change that, and what we have asked the government is to ratify the relevant conventions like MARPOL and fully incorporate them into our parliamentary legislation, and also introduce regulations for the transport of pellets within Sri Lanka, and also to introduce more bans for single-use plastic items. Thank you. That is the end of the presentation. If you have any questions, you can reach out to us on our Instagram at Pearl Protectors or email us at wave@pearlprotectors.org.
Thank you, Muditha, and thank you, Maleesha. That's a really interesting talk. Devastating to see the impact and know it's ongoing. But also you gave us a really good chance to plug our previous webinar, which Jamie has put in the chat about IMO. So if you want to find out more about the IMO, we have a webinar on that. And our next webinar is going to be on legislation in May, so different approaches to legislation. So thank you, Maleesha, for bringing up those points and giving us the opportunity to raise that. So we do have a couple of minutes for questions. So I saw that there was a hand raised from, was it
from Afra from Zero Waste?
Was that in the Maldives? So Afra, do you want to ask your question? Are you there? We can unmute you. Oh, I think we've lost Afra. If you come back,
No.
can you hear us, Afra? Okay, we will come back to you, or you can put your meeting in the chat. But we can't hear you at the moment. So, if there are more questions, feel free to put them in your chat or raise your hand, and we will try and get to you. In the meantime, while we're finding those questions, I will ask my question about what's the most useful thing that an NGO can do to influence the plastic treaty? I know that will be different for each NGO, but I would love to hear the speakers' take on this. Is it to go to their government? Is it to put their own submission in? What would you recommend? So I'm going to come first to you, Amy.
All right, that's tricky what the best one is, but I would say that engagement with the government is really important, especially at this phase. You know, we're trying to get a strong foundation of a treaty that can be strengthened over time, and we've seen that engagement with government engagement with stakeholders has changed submissions, it's changed views. Governments are listening to our recommendations, but now is a critical time because we're moving from, you know, the hypothetical stage into the reality. And so it's critical for people to continue to engage with their governments throughout the negotiating process, in the interim between meetings, and really advocate. You know, you can also weave that narrative on plastic pellets into other advocacy, because there's a lot of interrelated things with plastic. So I would say on our end, I think it's probably contacting your government and getting those bilateral meetings or meetings as a coalition member in, and continuing to advocate.
Thank you. Maleesha, did you have anything to add to that, or is that what you would recommend too?
Absolutely. I think NGOs need to work with the government because governments are often lobbied by these big corporates who come in with the money. And we see that happening in Sri Lanka all the time whenever we are to come up with a ban, for example, the sachet ban. It was, there were these companies who were publicly advocating against sachets, but on the inside, they were going to the government and advocating against it, saying we don't want this ban. And they also tried to, find loopholes to, escape the ban restrictions about sachets when the ban was in fact put in place. So if we have a strong, if we as NGOs lobby strongly to our government, then that's more powerful than the voices of the corporate people who have the money. So I think NGOs need to prioritize working closely with the government and their advocacy efforts.
Thank you. Right, I don't think we've had any questions come through, so I shall hand over to Jamie, who's going to just tell you a few bits about information sources.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. I'll just get my slide up. So we've got a couple of bits to run you through. The first one was I wanted to show you a new resource we've recently put on our Nerdle Hub in preparation for the upcoming Global Plastics Treaty talk. So for those of you not familiar, this is our Nerdle Hub. I'll be sure to put a link in the chat. If you come to the Nerdle Hub on the homepage here and come down to this section for the policy and legislation section, if you go into here and come down to the bottom of the policy and legislation section, we have a Global Plastics Treaty section here. And what we've done is we've gone through the submissions from each government to the UN ahead of the Plastics Treaty submission, the INC2 submissions. And what we've done is we've gone through and coded whether they mention plastic pellets, whether they mention stuff that phrases that could apply to plastic pellets, such as primary polymers or supply chain loss or virgin plastics. These kind of terms, coded them yellow and countries with no mention at all of plastic pellets or anything related are red. So by coming to this resource, you can check out the table here, find whether your country is submitted to the INC2 talks, and you can find out if they have included plastic pellets, if they haven't, or if they possibly have. It's in other wordings. So you can come. Green is obviously they've included pellets as well. Sorry if I forgot to mention that. And as well as that, we have a link here. If you follow this link, it'll take you to all the submissions, the full documents. So if you want to check your own country's submissions in more depth, then you can go and have a read through them there. We welcome any feedback on this as well. If you're having a bit of a more thorough read, please let us know if you have thoughts about it. The next thing is as Heather said, the next webinar will be on May the 24th at the moment. So we'll be sure to send out some information regarding that shortly, and some invites and such will be coming out. As mentioned, we in the chat, there was the recording from our last webinar on the IMO event, which is starting on the 24th of this month, so next week. Just if you are interested in hearing on some thoughts about that and learning about what you can do around that event. And we also have our dates for our next Great Global Nurdle Hunt, which will be taking place the 1st of October to the 31st of October this year. More information, resources will be coming out about that in the near future as well. And finally as well, we will be sending out a survey if you could for this webinar, if you could fill it in, and you could let us know what you thought, and we can use that to improve our next webinar, which, as I say, will be in May.
Great, thank you for that. Well, thank you all for joining us. It's been a really interesting discussion and mix of speakers today, and a lot for us to think about. And I know that those images of pellets on beaches in Sri Lanka are etched in my mind, and is certainly a motivation for us to get a really strong plastic treaty. So good luck with all your efforts. Please keep us up to date on what you're doing on the plastic treaty, on IMO, and any other solutions that you've got to pellet pollution. We certainly don't have all the answers yet, but we hope that these discussions are really useful for us to help get some of those solutions and some of those answers to what we do about pellet pollution. So thank you for your time, and thank you for your efforts in ending this pollution, and we'll hopefully see you at the next webinar in May.